Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Offshore wind projects face a number of challenges to becoming operational in a safe and sustainable manner. From initial planning and permitting to construction and operations, these projects face a number of challenges, including environmental assessments, supply chains, vessel requirements, and overall facilities management. Given some of these hurdles facing the industry today, the panel today will discuss addressing the fundamental obstacles in each of these areas. I am Craig Jones of Integral Consulting, and I'm here today with my colleague Pam Newbert of AECOM. On behalf of the Offshore Technology Conference, we are honored to host a panel of experts with a wide range of offshore and wind and energy experience to discuss how the safe offshore community can overcome the challenges to continue to develop a sustainable offshore wind future. Our format today will begin with each of our panelists discussing their experiences in offshore wind, followed by an open discussion where we will discuss questions from all of you. Without further delay, I'd like to pass to my colleague Pam to introduce our first panelist.
Hello, everyone. My name is Pamela Newbert, and I will introduce to you our first speaker today, Mr. Brian Crever. Brian Crever is the National Environmental Policy Act team lead with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management's Office of Renewable Energy Programs. Mr. Crever has been with BOEM for 9 years and has served as the lead for the environmental planning and review process for wind energy projects offshore of Massachusetts, North Carolina, and South Carolina. He is currently the lead for the Ocean Wind project and serves as the OREP lead for compliance under the Coastal Zone Management Act. I'd like to introduce Mr. Crever to present here today and welcome everybody. I see messages coming in. Welcome everybody to our session this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm going to try to share my screen here.
How's it going, Brian? Please bear with us.
Can people see my screen?
Cannot yet. Oh, something's happening. You're good.
All right.
Coming in loud and clear.
All right, and everyone can see the slideshow?
Yes, sir.
All right. So today I'm going to go over the permitting process and planning process for offshore wind energy development under the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is a bureau within the Department of the Interior, and we were established really under the Outer Continental Shelf Lands Act. Basically, the government recognizes that the OCS is a vital national resource and that it's held by the federal government for the use of the public for the expeditious and orderly development subject to environmental safeguards. And so really, the Renewable Energy Program itself got its authorization under the Energy Policy Act, and that allowed for the development of wind energy, ocean current energy, wave energy, and for transmission projects to occur on the Outer Continental Shelf. Originally, BOEM mostly did work with offshore oil and gas projects as well as marine mineral projects. And so really the mission of BOEM and of the Office of Renewable Energy Programs is to facilitate the responsible development of renewable energy resources on the OCS through conscientious planning, stakeholder engagement, comprehensive environmental analysis, and sound technical review. And you'll see how we do that throughout the presentation. So there are 4 phases of the renewable energy authorization process: planning and analysis, leasing, site assessment, and construction and operations. I'm not going to talk too much about the leasing process and how we do our auctions today, but I'm going to go in depth on planning and analysis, site assessment, and construction and operations. So planning and analysis generally takes about 2 years. There's intergovernmental task forces, various different ways that we could look for industry interest and information from the public. You see there it says call for information. I'm also going to talk about requests for interest. Then we have our area identification and environmental review process. The leasing process has various sale notices that go in the Federal Register, as well as an auction and the issuance of leases. Site assessment involves site characterization, so surveys to kind of characterize the bottom of the seafloor, as well as site assessment plans, which I'll talk more in depth on later. And then there's a construction and operations phase, which is about a 2-year review timeline and operation terms of 25 years. And that includes the construction operations plan and various reports that are required for engineering purposes after a plan is approved. And then there's also decommissioning at the very end. So here's a timeline for our overall process. And you can see that there's a lot in here, but I'm going to go through each step along the way. So the earliest thing you could possibly have would be a request for interest. And usually this occurs after we've formed an intergovernmental task force. They've been in the past state-based, but we've kind of adapted a more regional model and looking at it multiple states at a time. And so a request for interest doesn't necessarily have to happen, but it's one of the earliest things that we could do to look for interest, as well as find out information on the public for areas we're considering for development. Oftentimes then we'll skip straight to a call for information and nominations. This is kind of the official way we determine if there's competitive interest. And that generally has a 45-day public comment period. And from there, we kind of get our areas smaller through a process called area identification, where we deconflict, taking into account various stakeholder concerns. From there, we would do our environmental assessment process. And the environmental assessment would just cover the reasonably foreseeable consequences of lease issuance. And that's just site characterization surveys and site assessment activities, like the installation of a meteorological tower or buoy. So you don't really get into the actual development and construction of a wind facility at this stage in the process. And then you can see the different sale notices that we talked about earlier and an auction. So going back to the very beginning of the planning and analysis phase, we work with our intergovernmental task forces to come up with a planning area. And basically it looks at areas that may be the most suitable for offshore wind development. This is very high level, looking at things like, is the bottom suited for offshore wind? How are the water depths? Things like that. And so it comes up with a larger planning area. From there, we reduce the area based on things like Department of Defense concerns, very large conflicts that we come across. Is there a traffic separation scheme for navigation, something like that? We wouldn't want to put a wind facility in the middle of that. So we come up with a smaller area, and we could issue a request for interest, trying to determine the level interest in offshore wind leasing, and also looking at more information on the suitability of the area for development. From there, we could move into a call for information and nominations, and we're really getting really kind of reducing the amount of information we're looking for. We're really trying to find out special considerations and analysis. What conditions should we place on these call areas, and really what areas should we be considered for leasing? So we're really trying to really hone in on the real issues at this point. And then a wind energy area, that's where we have really tried to deconflict the area as much as possible. And so these are areas that we would determine to be suitable for leasing and the basis of a lease area. So we're looking at all stakeholder concerns, visual impacts, commercial fishing, recreational fishing, issues with Section 106, just anything you could think of that involves space use conflicts, trying to reduce those conflicts and come up with a suitable area for leasing. And then lease areas could be the entire wind energy area, or it could be portions of the wind energy area. Generally, we divide the wind energy areas up into smaller lease areas. And so from there, you can see that we've come up with a lot of different leases and areas that are in the process of being developed. On the West Coast, you primarily have call areas. On the East Coast, you primarily have leases that have been issued, as well as a few call areas that you can see, like the New York Bight area, as well as the areas in South Carolina. And then there's a couple of wind energy areas that haven't moved forward to leasing, off in North Carolina, the southern portion of North Carolina. But we have completed 8 lease sales. We have 16 active offshore leases that have been issued. We've approved 8 site assessment plans, 1 general activities plan, and we currently have 10 construction and operation plans up for review right now. And we anticipate receiving 6 more within the next 12 months. And we're still considering leasing for 5 areas. So you can see that there's a lot going on right now for leasing. And we currently have steel in the water for the Virginia research lease, which was 2 turbines off of Virginia. Oops. Skipped ahead a little bit there. Okay, so briefly about the site assessment submittal and review process. So a site assessment plan describes the installation, operation, maintenance, and decommissioning of a meteorological tower or buoy. We generally see meteorological buoys and not towers because they can collect the same amount of information generally and through a flight hour system, and it doesn't require the installation of a larger tower. After lease issuance, a leasee has 12 months called the preliminary term to submit their site assessment plan. BOEM would then review the site assessment plan and determine whether it contains all the required information, a completeness review, and whether it is adequate for conducting technical and environmental reviews, so adequacy. The leasee has up to 5 years to collect site assessment activities upon the approval of the SAP. After those 5 years, they are required to submit a construction and operations plan. Generally, the leasees and developers have been submitting their construction operations plans a lot earlier than that 5-year timeline. And this is just straight from our regulations showing some of the information that's required in a SAP. I won't really go too much into that, but if you want to take a look, it's 30 CFR 585-610A. And then survey results and supporting data for SAPs is 30 CFR 585-610B. And additional information required, like consistency certification with Coastal Zone Management Act, archaeological and socioeconomic resources, biological resources, things like that, 30 CFR 585-611B. So how we cover this in our environmental review process, as I mentioned earlier, the activities within a SAP are covered in our leasing environmental assessments. For meteorological buoys, we would apply a categorical exclusion. And then for meteorological towers, we'd likely prepare a determination of NEPA adequacy to make sure that our environmental assessment adequately covered the activities being proposed. For Coastal Zone Management Act, we prepare a consistency determination prior to leasing that covers SAP activities. After finalizing our technical and environmental reviews, BOEM may approve, disapprove, or approve the SAP with modifications. Moving on to a construction and operation plan. So this is, for those who don't know, the actual nuts and bolts of what would be in a wind energy facility. So the actual proposal or application from a developer for the project. And it includes project information, survey results, overall site investigation reports, certified verification agent nomination package, an oil spill response plan, a safety management system information, and other information on hazards and water quality. Too far again. And a COP must demonstrate that it complies with applicable laws, regulations, and lease provisions, that it covers safety. There's no unreasonable interference with existing uses, no undue harm or damage to the environment or existing uses, uses the best available and safest technology, uses best management practice, and properly trained personnel. Now, more on our process here. Once we receive a COP, similar to what we do with a SAP, we conduct a completeness review to ensure all the required information is included. Once it's deemed complete, we begin a sufficiency review, determining if the information is sufficient to conduct our environmental and technical reviews. This process takes approximately 6 months. After reviewing the COP to determine if the information is sufficient, we also do a separate review where we look and determine if there's enough information for the public to comment on a notice of intent to prepare an EIS. So is the project information informed enough for the public to make those comments? And here's our generic construction operation plan environmental review schedule. The COP submittal, as I said, approximately 6 months until we go out with an NOI, notice of intent. Public scoping, there's a 30-day public comment period. So from the notice of intent to prepare an environmental assessment to the issuance of a draft environmental impact statement, sorry, I should say environmental impact statement or EIS, it's approximately 12 months. And then from the draft environmental impact statement to the publication of a final environmental impact statement, it's about 7 months. And in between that time, there's a 45-day public comment period on the draft environmental impact statement, and there are public hearings that are held. Once the final environmental impact statement is published, there's a minimum of a 30-day waiting period prior to issuing a decision. And within 90 days of that record of decision, or ROD, all federal authorizations have to be completed. So this is approximately a 2-year timeline. There's been, you might have heard about some streamlining efforts that have been going on in the federal government recently. A real big one that we deal with is Executive Order 13807. What it requires is that all federal environmental reviews and authorization decisions for major infrastructure projects, which every one of these offshore wind projects will be completed within 2 years of the notice of intent. It requires one federal decision, so all the agencies working together that have a decision in the process. It was implemented by an April 2018 Memorandum of Understanding between all relevant federal agencies. Requires a single record of decision for all federal agency authorizations. Requires us to concur on a permitting timeline, concur on purpose and needs statement, concur on alternatives to be carried forward for evaluation, and concur on preferred alternatives. And so you can see these concurrence points now within the overall process. There's also Title 41 of the FAST Act, Fixing America's Surface Transportation Infrastructure Act. So wind developers can opt into this process. It's very similar to one federal decision, but one thing that's a little different is that it's optional for the applicant. A coordinated project plan is due within 60 days and is updated quarterly, and it has enhanced legal protection. But one federal decision was based heavily on FAST 41, so there's a lot of similarities. Finally, a secretarial order affects our projects. This affects all Department of the Interior projects. It establishes page limits, 150 pages for standard EISs and 300 pages for unusually complex EISs. And it establishes a 1-year time frame for EISs. However, any project that is a FAST 41 or one federal decision project, it is exempt from that requirement. So the 2-year timeline applies for all of our projects. And that's all I have for today. I went through that fairly quickly, but that covers our review process as well as kind of where we are with our leasing currently.
Brian, thank you very much. That was an excellent introduction to the process, and thank you very much for the good, thorough explanation. It's my pleasure to introduce Greg Lampman next. Greg Lampman manages NYSERDA's Environmental Research Program, which aims to increase the understanding and awareness of the environmental and public health impacts of energy choices and provide a scientific foundation for creating effective and equitable energy-related environmental policies and resource management practices. Much of Greg's time has been focused on advancing environmental aspects of the New York State Offshore Wind Master Plan, which is designed to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind energy for New York State. Through his work, Greg collaborates with stakeholders and develops strategies to address the challenges of offshore wind energy development. Thanks, Greg.
Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning in some cases. Can you see my screen?
Absolutely.
Great, thank you, Craig. I'm impressed with the geographic diversity of the participants on this, so I'm very, very pleased to be here. My name is Greg Lampman. I'm going to be representing kind of a state's perspective on the development of offshore wind and discussing the role that New York State has been playing in the development of offshore wind in the U.S. So first, our work here in New York is predicated on the fact that we have a goal of 100% clean carbon-free electricity by 2040. This is one of the most aggressive goals in the nation. And in fact, offshore wind plays a very key part in our advancing that goal.
And
our tagline...
Greg, I do want to interrupt you for one moment. We can't see your slides, so maybe try resharing your slides. Is
that working now?
Not yet. And thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt the good flow you had there.
Is that working now?
There we go. Perfect.
Okay, picking up again. So our work has been designed to advance the responsible and cost-effective development of offshore wind. That's been our tagline, and so we approach this from a number of directions. So our legislative mandated goal in New York State is 9,000 megawatts by 2035. This is enough to power about 6 million homes. And if you're thinking about a 12 megawatt turbine, that's about 750 turbines installed in the space by 2035. 750, a rather large and aggressive goal.
And hello, it looks like Greg's internet may have dropped. In the meantime, we may see if Greg can join, but we'll move on to our next speaker, and Pamela will introduce our next speaker.
Oh, hi, everyone. We apologize for the technical difficulties here, so please bear with us. Our next speaker, we'll have Ruth speak next, and then when Greg comes back on, I have no doubt something will be fixed. We'll bring him into the conversation here after Ruth's presentation. So let me introduce Ruth. Dr. Ruth Perry joined Shell as a marine scientist and a regulatory specialist in 2014. Ruth has nearly 15 years of experience in environmental permitting and regulatory analysis, ocean research, and in developing ocean and energy policy. Ruth also develops a number of marine science and ocean technology partnerships for Shell's offshore energy projects in the Americas that can be integrated into regulatory policy, management, and decision-making. Prior to Shell, Dr. Perry earned a doctorate in oceanography from Texas A&M University, and she also worked for NOAA. And I know Ruth personally for many years now. We've worked on several projects together. So it's my pleasure to introduce you, and you can take it from here. Ruth, thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Pam. Am I coming across?
You're coming across loud and clear, for sure.
And the slides are up?
Slides not yet.
Okay, let's try this again. All right, well, while that's loading, thank you everyone for joining in on this topic. It is a really important and emerging topic in the US, and I'm glad to be here virtually to speak about it. I'll say it's quite different being online than being at OTC in person. I think if you haven't been to OTC, it's one of the largest conferences, certainly in the world, and the largest in Houston. So maybe one day we'll get back to that and talking about this in person. And thank you, Pam, for that introduction. It's always glad to be working with you on these kind of things too, as well as projects. So I'm going to focus a little bit on the environmental challenges and opportunities from a developer perspective. You heard Brian talk about the regulatory perspective, the federal government side for the US. The Bureau of Ocean Energy and Management is the lead federal agency, but these projects include a wide variety of permitting agencies, both at the federal level and the state level, depending on where these projects are. And so that has been a very interesting challenge, but also has provided some opportunities to do a few things early in the process versus some of the things we're doing on the oil and gas side, where you have 60 years of oil and gas platforms in the offshore. We only have 7 platforms or turbines in the US, 5 of those in state waters and 2 of those in federal waters off Virginia. So we're really at the beginning. And so you'll hear a little bit more about that from some of the other developers. So I always have to cover this from my lawyers. We're not talking about anything commercially or economically sensitive or related to Shell's portfolio. We're only going to talk about the environment. So hopefully that doesn't disappoint anybody. Just to give you an overview of Shell Wind, our experience and portfolio, we have the potential now to generate over 6 megawatts of power once all of our projects that are worldwide are in operations. That's a combination of onshore, offshore, and floating wind, and you can just see that profile from a quick glance here. In the US offshore, Shell has 2 joint ventures. One of those is off the coast of New Jersey, Atlantic Shores, and the other one is Mayflower off of Massachusetts. And we're working with 2 European partners that bring a significant experience in project delivery for offshore wind in Europe, as well as Shell's combined experience in offshore wind in Europe. So we're excited to see this build in the US, and we're excited to translate a lot of our information and knowledge and experience from operating in the oil and gas side into offshore wind in the US. So an overview, you saw this on Brian's slide. This is the renewable energy process for the US, the federal process only. And what I want to point out on this slide is there's a lot of pre-work that's done before we actually get to the installation and construction phase. So these projects are what we like to call permitting or development heavy, meaning there's a front end of multiple development phase years before you get into CapEx, OpEx, and such. And so during that time, there's upwards of 3 to 5 years of site assessment to support project engineering and design, but also to support the data collection that's required to meet a number of US statutes. The major one that Brian referred to was NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. And so we have to collect quite a bit of data at the front end that informs the construction and operations plan and our project design envelope, which is the range of what we'd like to build. And we have to be able to assess the environmental impacts of that of the full range of the project design envelope and back that up with baseline data, geophysics, geotechnical, wind resource assessments, just a wide portfolio of environmental and technical data before we submit our plan for review with the federal government and the state governments. And so that's a little bit different if you're familiar with the US regulatory process for oil and gas. And so there's just a lot of front end work, and we'll be talking about that a little more throughout my presentation. So in the US, we have a number of challenges where offshore wind lease areas are currently leased or in the development phases, and actually in the construction phase if you consider the projects in Virginia and Block Island. So all of these current leases are in the Atlantic coast. Part of operating off the Atlantic coast and the US EEZ in general is their sensitive habitats and species, including endangered species, but also a number of large marine mammals, sea turtles, and other fish and commercially important species. The commercial industry is the commercial fishing industry is one of those major stakeholder groups in this area, and are responsible for bringing in much of the US seafood production. And you can see this in my diagram in terms of the value, where it's upwards of almost $400 million a year that comes in through just Massachusetts alone. And the commercial fishing industry was one of the first industries in this historic part of the US. And so it's one of the oldest as well. And so they've been there a long time. That doesn't mean that there's opportunities for coexistence, which I'll refer to on my next slide. But I want to point out that fishing in this general area is important. That's where most of the highest value species groups are caught for the US. And those 2, and out of the 5 you see, are in the Northeast, are the lobster and the scallops. Mid-ocean conditions, for those of you globally who work in the Atlantic and in the North Sea, know that we have similar mid-ocean challenges in working with the U.S. Northeast, from nor'easters, derechos, hurricanes, and some pretty significant winter weather. So this is a very challenging physical environment as well. And that's different than the oil and gas footprint for offshore in the US, which is more in our subtropical areas in the Gulf of Mexico, in the US and Mexico. So definitely different conditions. And so that becomes some environmental challenges that we have to overcome as well. Data collection, if any of you who work in the environmental assessment side of the house or the science side of the house, like me, doing field work generally is expensive and it's time consuming, and it requires significant resources to go out and collect this data. And anything with working in offshore, you know that there are a number of challenges in being able to collect and operate in the offshore environments. Given that these leases are in the Northeast, one of Shell's projects being Mayflower, but Vineyard, as you'll hear Rachel Pachter talk about, is in one of the oldest areas of the US. There's archaeological significant areas in the geopaleo landforms, so in the subsurface, in terms of how those landforms were formed, all the way up to visual archaeological significance with the history of this region in general. And so there's cultural heritage built into that from the communities along the Cape of Massachusetts, but also tribal nations as well. And so with that archaeological significance and cultural heritage, those are challenges that these projects have to work with in terms of looking at the wide span of potential impacts from viewshed to impacts on the seafloor and in the subsurface. And also, this is new and unknown in the US. You may hear this a lot. We know that there's quite a significant ramp up and presence of offshore wind in European countries, but this is really new and unknown in the US. And it's different in oil and gas in the sense that oil and gas leasing and the development of oil and gas resources typically involves a couple exploratory drill ships or production asset. But when we talk about commercial or utility scale wind farms, we're talking about tens to 100 turbines in the water. And the spacing of those, the orientation of those, that matters from a technical perspective, but it also matters from an environmental perspective based on where those are constructed. So that is new in the US context, right? There is not 40 to 60 years of what we like to say coexisting or living with oil and gas structures in the Gulf of Mexico, or really any substantial amount of offshore structure in the US EEZ. So trying to work through that is one of the challenges as well. And this just is a visual representation of some of that archaeological significance and cultural heritage I spoke about before. So I don't like to dwell on the challenges. What are the opportunities? So specific to the environmental opportunities, I like to think of the new and unknown as an opportunity as well as a challenge. Given that these structures, ideally the structure that is in the water is less complex than oil and gas. You don't have subsea infrastructure, you don't have the dynamic positioning of the different types of oil and gas structures. They're pretty simple. And because they're pretty simple, these kind of platforms offer up an opportunity where we can do more autonomous environmental monitoring. We can put sensors on turbines, we can put sensors under the water, we can do quite a bit of data collection using these structures. And the scientific community is really thinking about understanding the impacts of climate change and other challenges and constraints on the ocean environment, how we might be able to use offshore turbine grids as opportunities to collect ocean observations. And that is a much simpler process when you're dealing with essentially a less complex structure than an oil and gas structure that has a lot of moving parts. that are happening under the water. And so there's some opportunities there in terms of how we can use these structures as monitoring systems that we can, and if we do this with early coordination, we can figure out how to better utilize these as platforms of opportunity to collect data about the environment. There's going to be increased data collection. I covered this on the first slide. There's that 3 to 5 year period of site assessment work before the COP that includes significant amount of data on characterizing your site, but also developing the baselines of the site that you're working in. And many of us are neighbors. For instance, the leases in Massachusetts and Rhode Island are all adjoined. And so we're coordinating on how we can increase data collection and standardize our processes across all those adjoining leases so that the environmental data that we're collecting can be collated together and synthesized as one large data set for the region versus individual project data sets. Offshore wind, like oil and gas, or unlike oil and gas, does not require a significant amount of personnel on the structures. And so offshore wind uses quite a bit of autonomous technology to do the monitoring and health of the operations of the wind farms. And so this actually provides an opportunity for us to think about how we can integrate autonomy into our environmental monitoring. There's quite a bit of work in the US that's done around autonomous systems in Department of Defense and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. But this is also an opportunity to work with offshore wind to utilize autonomous systems below and at the surface to do environmental detection of marine species, to relay data that's being collected from seafloor sensors or turbine sensors back to shore. So there's a number of opportunities here that are in the works to think about how we use the autonomy of offshore wind industry to help us do our environmental work. In collaboration, this, because it is new, like Brian said, there's a number of agencies and stakeholders involved. It really is an opportunity to do this collectively and collaborate on how we do this at scale before we have the utility grid, the utility scale of wind farms built. Conservation is another thing I'd like to just highlight, at least from the Shell perspective. We've been working with some of our Shell partners on conservation efforts in this region. You know, or you may not be aware, North Atlantic right whales are a critical species in this area. You'll hear from Vineyard as well as us that we're doing work together to monitor and detect these species because we want to be able to do our operations safe and responsibly. But this is also opportunity, given how much work we're doing on the water, to potentially improve some of the impacts that we know to these species, such as derelict fishing gear. And so there are some conservation efforts that we're working towards as well, in addition to meeting our regulatory environmental requirements. And you'll see in a second, there's opportunity for unique partners and partnerships across this industry and across our stakeholders. So just to overview what some of those are, local research. So many of the lease areas are doing lease-specific research around fisheries, marine mammals, birds. Part of this is feeding into the monitoring and mitigation that will be required of these projects as they go through the process. Other parts of it is working with stakeholders to really understand what's in the water. If any of you have done ocean impact assessment or are involved in ocean research, there's always a number of gaps. And so this is an opportunity where industry can help fill some of those gaps, and we can use research monitoring as a mitigation tool. There's also a lot of work for regional research. So I talked about the importance of the commercial fishing industry, but also the recreational fishing industry. And so those groups have come together with the developers and the federal and state agencies to develop a research consortium. Basically, that allows us to advance the coexistence of offshore wind and fishing through research, science, standardization of monitoring techniques, some of the things I alluded to with how we might use wind turbines to understand changes in the ecosystem. And so this allows us to integrate funds across US government, state governments, developers, and potentially other fishing groups and partners, so that we can really focus on the research that's needed at the regional level that will help decision makers at the local level. The other side is data sharing. If you've ever heard me speak at OTC, I talk quite a bit about Shell's ocean observing partnerships. This is true for offshore wind too, and it's not just a Shell thing. I'm glad to say other projects are doing the same, where we're utilizing the NOAA infrastructure to start sharing some of the real-time data that we're collecting at our sites. The easiest of those is metocean conditions. We look at the conditions for our criteria studies and engineering, but also to do the wind resource assessments that are required for our regulatory process. And because we have metocean buoys that are out there that are standard globally, we're sharing that data that's being collected in real time. And so that's potentially up to 35 years of ocean conditions and adding to the ocean infrastructure for the US. And a lot of that data can be made public, and it is being made public right now. And so if you'd like more information, I can follow up on those sites, but you can find it through NOAA generally. And then the last one is monitoring. Given the amount of work that's being done at the lease level, but then regionally, there's baseline data collection, but there's also requirements to do pre, during, and post-construction monitoring of many of the environmental resources. And so this is offering up long-term monitoring, long-term data sets. And so we're really putting an effort behind how do we standardize these data sets early? How do we get process and procedures set so that all of this data can essentially be compiled and it can support academic research and decision making, and you don't end up with 15 different types of data or data sets or data collection, and we are down the road and we can't use any of that data. So we're really trying to increase the usability of that data, not only for the regulatory process, but for the stakeholders to use who are doing research and monitoring conditions in the area, independent and dependent on offshore wind. And so I'll leave it with that today, and I hope you enjoyed just a little bit of that overview. And I'd like to just call out the acknowledgements for the groups that helped contribute to this presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and thank you for that great talk and emphasizing the role of science in us moving forward. That was fantastic.
Thanks, Greg.
Greg was able to rejoin us, so we will transition back to Greg so he can pick up where he left off. And with no further delay, Greg Lampman.
Apologies, just confirm you can see my slides, please.
We've got it.
Excellent, thank you. Apologies, folks, technical difficulties, I assume. But so again, just starting at the top here. So New York is advancing offshore wind energy predicated on the fact that we have a goal of achieving 100% carbon-free electricity by 2040. This is the most aggressive in the nation. And offshore wind is a very large part of what we're trying to accomplish, of our goal in accomplishing this.
Greg,
So,
I apologize for interrupting you again. It appears you're not sharing the full screen so you're sharing the slide preview. Always our challenges with multiple screens these days.
yeah, I'm not seeing full screen.
I think if you go to your PowerPoint and choose which screen you're sharing to. It's not just our challenges of offshore wind these days. London technology. In too many ways to accomplish what we need to accomplish. Also, I want to remind everyone, we do see some fantastic comments coming in with questions as well. So we will be recording questions and we will have a Q&A period after all the speakers are done. So if you do have specific questions for each speaker, don't hesitate to put them in the comments. We are looking at the comments now and making notes on those questions. So we will be addressing those questions. So thank you very much for all of your good comments and questions. And please keep the dialogue up in the comments box. We have great participants from all over the world with some good questions and comments. So thank you all very much.
Apologies, Craig. It doesn't seem to be going there.
No problem, Greg.
Should I just continue?
Sure, and maybe just be aware that you're sharing your preview screen, and you can point to the slide that you're talking to on the preview screen.
I am. All right, so I'm on. You can't see even which one's up. So New York is advancing, has the most aggressive goal in the country of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind. And the way we've been describing our approach is developing offshore wind in a way that is both responsible and cost effective. From a regional perspective, New York State is one of a number of states who are advancing offshore wind for a combined regional goal of about 30 gigawatts. 30 gigawatts, if you're talking about a 12 megawatt machine, will result in approximately 2,500 offshore wind turbines in addition to the substations and related infrastructure. This is a very aggressive goal and requires a fair amount of real estate. In this slide, you'll see a pie graph on the left that's showing the regional goals by state, with New York and New Jersey making a little over half of those. And on the map, you'll see areas in blue are lease areas that have been identified by BOEM and leased to individual developers. And in green, you'll see draft wind energy areas that are in consideration of being converted to lease areas by BOEM. It's important to achieve goals, have sufficient real estate to achieve goals, but in reality, you need excess capacity in order to achieve goals through competition, which is so important for offtake prices. So far, New York has managed to contract about 1,700 megawatts of offshore wind that will be constructed by 2024. These projects are comprised of Sunrise Wind, which is between eastern Long Island and Massachusetts, and Empire Wind, which is a little to the southeast of New York City. Combined, this will produce enough power for about 1 million homes, but have a combined economic impact of $3.2 billion for upstate, downstate, and Long Island. Offshore wind is both a path to achieving renewable energy goals and carbon-free electricity, but also an opportunity for economic development. And we approach it as such. So with these two projects, we're looking at supporting more than 1,600 jobs, many of which paying over $100,000 a year. But this is just the beginning. In our current solicitation, which is on the street, which will advance our current 1,700, awarded contracts, we are looking at awarding up to 2,500 megawatts of additional renewable energy. And we evaluate our proposals based 70% on price, 20% on economic benefits, and 10% on viability, which really relates to the ability for the project to achieve its goals and timeline. Economic developments, as you can see, make up 20%, are an important part. Additionally, we have coupled this year's solicitation for offshore wind with port infrastructure opportunity. So New York State has been working with regional ports and have identified 11 pre-qualified ports and is offering $100 million in grant money and $100 million in low interest financing to developers to put in bids and match that on a 50-50 basis. So offshore wind developers who are proposing to this year's solicitation will not only be proposing their offshore wind project, but also port infrastructure development projects, helping to make New York State the hub for development and maintenance of these offshore wind projects. As I said in the beginning, our effort here is not just to advance offshore wind, but to do it in a way that is both responsible and cost effective. And built into this solicitation are a number of measures that help us achieve that goal. So first, we are requiring developers to consider their carbon content in their project designs and sourcing. As in our last round, we have worked with stakeholders in the space, particularly those in the environmental world, as well as the fishing world, to understand what their greatest concerns for offshore wind are. And we require developers to put forth mitigation plans to address those concerns, and then meet with those groups periodically over the course of the project to discuss and update those plans. We've also found that there is limited information as it relates to baseline monitoring for wildlife and key commercial fish stocks, and we're requiring developers to provide a minimum of $10,000 per megawatt to support baseline monitoring. This may or may not be associated with their permits. It's really designed to help advance the understanding for the industry itself. We are also launching a new offshore wind training institute at SUNY Farmingdale and SUNY Stony Brook here in New York with $20 million. The intention is to make sure that our workforce in New York is prepared and ready to service offshore wind. We are also doing undertaking a power grid study to assure that the 9 gigawatts of offshore wind that we are seeking to procure are able to integrate and be distributed throughout the system as efficiently as possible. So working with the grid and the dry side issues to assure that's the case. We regularly work with stakeholder groups. This is just an example of 2 that we work with: our Environmental Technical Working Group, or ETWIG, and our Fishing Technical Working Group, or FTWIG. On the ETWIG side, we are conducting a State of the Science workshop as it relates to cumulative impacts this fall. We've been working with a scientific framework to understand risks to birds and bats, and a number of other activities. On the commercial fishing side, as an example, we have been working with fishermen to understand how they use the New York Bight to help inform the BOEM lease process on the new lease areas in the New York Bight. We're also pulling together a synthesis of knowledge around submarine cables, cable fall, cable landing, installation techniques, and so forth, just to keep everyone on the same page as to the state of the science and how cables are installed and operated. We additionally support third-party contracted research. We've got a number of projects that are in place now. An example of the first one is working with the Renewable Energy Laboratory on fishing access to turbine arrays to try to understand what constrains that access and how to maximize access. And we've got a number of projects that are aggregating data, as well as looking at relationships between, or modeling relationships between different species. And finally, on the bottom is one that's designed to really understand how do we make the best use of data that's collected. So trying to standardize monitoring protocols as it relates to nanotags, hopefully leveraging data from multiple projects to inform thinking and permitting. And finally, New York is also working on some pre-development activities. Our intention here is to try to de-risk sites as much as possible so that when developers are submitting proposals to NYSERDA, they have as much information as they need to put in a solid proposal. We've been conducting digital aerial surveys across the New York Bight for the last 3 years, collecting more than 3.5 million images of wildlife. That tells us something about the spatial and temporal distribution of species and their relative abundance. We have 2 metocean buoys deployed in Hudson North and Hudson South, collecting both wind speed data as well as metocean data. Again, the intention is to inform leaseholders eventually of the conditions on their sites. Those buoys are additionally outfitted with a number of wildlife monitoring devices, including passive acoustic monitoring, bird and bat detection devices, and so forth. And then finally, we currently have a vessel in space collecting geophysical conditions, which may transition into a geotechnical survey at some point in the future. But again, all of these projects are designed to try to inform developers earlier about some planning level numbers about their lease areas so that they can provide more informed proposals to NYSERDA at offtake. And with that, I'll wrap up and turn it back over to Craig.
Hi, well, Greg, that was an awesome presentation, and it looks like you have me instead of Greg. So
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry for you too, but no, thank you. I think that was an excellent presentation, and is definitely exciting to hear about all of the science and the marine science that's happening and taking place that you're leading. So I appreciate your presentation very much. And our next speaker will be Rachel. Please post, and again, a note for everyone out there in the world. It's really wonderful to see everyone from all the different countries and locations. Please post your comments in our comments chat section, and we'll get to them at the end of our presentations here. I appreciate that very much. I'd like to introduce Rachel Patcher, who is with Vineyard Wind, and who will talk to us about her projects. And Rachel is 18 years. She is the experience with offshore wind development. She is Vineyard Wind's Chief Development Officer. She's specifically trained in permitting and regulatory compliance, environmental and site investigations, federal, state, and local regulations. She is familiar with the stakeholder engagement process and public relations. Rachel led and finalized the approval for the first fully permitted offshore wind farm in U.S. federal waters. Rachel oversees all of the Vineyard Wind's development, permitting, environmental activities, as well as workforce development, community engagement, and cross-industry initiatives on environmental and fisheries matters. And Rachel has a degree in geology from the University of Alaska. I will say that this is sort of perfect timing from a perspective of Rachel can talk about more collaboration and more science building upon what Dr. Perry and what Greg Lampin just discussed. So I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. I'm sure we all are. Thank you, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela. Can you guys hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
Great. Hi, everyone. I will also express sadness at the missed opportunity to come to OTC. This would have been my first opportunity to do that. So unfortunately, that didn't happen this year. So I look forward to a future event where I can meet a lot of new folks in this group as offshore wind is growing. And in my introduction, Pamela mentioned I've been working in offshore wind in the U.S. for closing in on 20 years now. So we've been working on this for a long time. We've been far surpassed in Europe over that time frame. We actually started at about the same time, but it's been slower getting this industry off the ground here in the U.S. The good news on that front is that there's a lot to learn from how it's been done. So there's a significant numbers of lessons learned that we take advantage of, particularly on the construction operations side. We're seeing a massive growth in the available technology, but also there's a lot of local pieces to this. And particularly in the Northeast, there's a very strong, the Northeast US, there's a very strong local component to pretty much everything that's done here. So that's why we kind of hear this emphasis on stakeholders and these ongoing conversations that I think Greg talked a lot about and Ruth talked about. So just real quick, who is Vineyard Wind? So Vineyard Wind is a joint venture. And as Ruth mentioned, Shell's projects are also joint ventures. So you do see a fair amount of that in the lease space here for the offshore wind project. So we are a joint venture of Avangrid Renewables and Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners, both groups that have extensive, deep benches of experience in this extensive development of offshore wind throughout the world. So they bring a significant amount of that to the table. Avangrid Renewables is also a big onshore developer. Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners was actually a spin out of, they were some members of the Ørsted team that are no longer there anymore. That happened in 2012. Yeah, so a lot of good experience with the ownership of the project and a big, strong local team. Next pick, no, actually I'm doing the slides, aren't I? So real quick, the lease areas that Vineyard Wind has, and I'm gonna kind of try just to not repeat what other folks say, but to narrow us in a little bit, and then I'll zoom us back out. So we're kind of going from the macro and micro and back and forth a little bit here. But Vineyard Wind is a good project to talk about from a project specific standpoint, because we were the first of this new generation of projects to submit a construction operations plan. As Brian talked about those, we actually did that at the end of 2017. We filed state permits at the same time, and shortly thereafter actually won the first of this generation of projects power purchase agreement, which is our basic revenue source with the utilities here in the Northeast. And I think Greg talked a little bit about how this all sort of comes together with the states having requirements for either utilities or the state entities to purchase offshore wind, which gives us the revenue certainty that we need in order to spend money on permitting and then ultimately finance the projects. So Vineyard Wind has 2 lease areas, and I think Ruth referred to the Massachusetts, Rhode Island areas. That's this collective area in the picture you see here. I don't know if you can see the cursor moving, but so we've got Cape Cod here, Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket. You see the end of Long Island here. So kind of covering all of these different areas, but there's a number of lease areas. Vineyard Wind actually has the 2 yellow ones. And the first one that was obtained is lease area 501. And then several years later, 522. Lease area 501 is where the first Vineyard Wind project is, and it's actually in this first in the northern portion of this area, and that keeps us in the shallower waters for the first project. And I will note that I do think, I don't know if Brian would fully concur with this, but I do think when BOEM originally started to lease these in 2015, we saw that these would be a single project in the neighborhood of a single project per lease area. But the growth of wind turbine technology, where you're seeing at the time a 3.6 megawatt turbine is now was the standard. Now you see a 12, 14 megawatt turbine is where we're heading, is where we really are at this point. And so we take up a lot less seabed in terms of making for a project. So I think that's I think that's a key point, that we have multiple projects within the lease areas potentially. Vineyard Wind 1, as I mentioned, the timing, Vineyard Wind also has a second project that has a PPA within the lease area 501, which is the Park City Wind Project, which is supplying Connecticut with power. So I think we'll end up talking a fair amount about the regulatory process, but I thought a graphic would be helpful for this group to kind of get an idea. Brian talked a lot about the federal process. So on the left here, this is sort of a real-time update, if you will, of the first Vineyard Wind project. So on the left, we have the federal permitting. So you've got BOEM's piece here, which leads to the COP review and ultimately the NEPA review, and then addresses all of the ancillary processes, Endangered Species Act, National Historic Preservation Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, et cetera. So those are all part of the process. They work with a number of consulting agencies through the process, again, as Brian discussed, but noting that several other agencies along here also need to issue their own permits for the projects. So these are all underway. Vineyard Wind had a delay last year where they went from a draft environmental impact statement to a supplemental impact statement, and that was tied very much to the big interest and the big growth in the industry. And then Ruth also mentioned the projects are connected physically to the shore, to the grid, and so the cables run to points of contact and then upland, usually for several miles as well, to get to a substation. So we do enter state waters. In our case, it's all 3 nautical miles from shore. And so you go through your pretty standard, like what you would do to permit a cable in state waters only. So we also do that in parallel, and that's largely a separate process. This is the example of where we are in Massachusetts, but just to illustrate that there's a parallel process there. And there are also local permits. As I mentioned, there's local piece is a big part of this. So the towns that you might go through actually will need to issue permits for projects. So the theme of this conversation was challenges and solutions, and I like to call challenges also opportunities because, well, they are. So I just want to highlight some. I assume we'll get into some of these in conversation, but I think I'm going to feed off of what everyone else has said, but to keep the conversation going. So it's a new industry, which is always a challenge. It's a new industry in the U.S. We should note. It's not a new industry worldwide. But it is a new industry in the U.S. So that creates, for us, it's, workforce challenges and opportunities, supply chain challenges and opportunities, and ports and infrastructure and the buildup of those. So those are both challenges and those are both opportunities. Regulatory certainty is a challenge that we face. I think the first project is definitely with a delay on the EIS last year. Really, I think, and probably everyone in the conference really, gets the concept of, if you know what it's going to take to get through your regulatory process, you can make a lot more commitments and when it's going to happen. But that's not just true for us as developers. That's also true for the supply chain. The electrical grid is a big one for us. We do need to get all of this power into the various grids, and I will note that probably nowhere in the U.S., but certainly not in the Northeast, it was not planned for the power to come from offshore. So we tend to see weaker grid links, sort of as you get further out away from the main cities and the mainland. So we do need to get this power into the load demands. In the early projects, there's some good solutions there, but I think even without this, grid modernization is a topic of discussion. So this kind of adds to that discussion of getting, how do we get all this power in terms of the goals that Greg mentioned for all the projects. And that will take infrastructure upgrades, that will take planning. I think on the environmental side, we want to coordinate the cables so that we're having the least environmental impact. And so all of that is a part of the discussion. And then I think Ruth already talked about it, but the mitigation on environmental impacts is critical piece to making this all very successful. And so there's a lot of effort that goes into that. And so I just, on the solution side, I would note that some of this is about investment. So investment in education and retraining the workforce is exciting for us and a huge opportunity and a lot of work. And regulatory certainty, as I mentioned, is a big piece for the supply chain, the ports, the infrastructure, the development itself, the commitment, and actually for the grid planning, for people to know when the power itself is going to be ready. So that's always important. I mentioned the grid infrastructure, I talked about that. And then the partnerships are incredibly critical. So whether it be stakeholders, NGOs, fishing, other areas of interest, local communities in particular, and how do we partner with those folks so they're a part of the project, because we do cross many jurisdictions. And we have a long process that involves a lot of public comments. Public-private partnerships are also critical. We work with several agencies, federal, state, and local, and industry partnering with industry here. And that's, these adjacent leases, and how do we like to call it not passing the buck. How do we work together to make sure that we're addressing issues as an industry and not working against each other, especially where you see adjacent lease areas in the Northeast, but even up and down the Northeast. And we are doing that more and more as we grow as an industry. And then I think, Ruth mentioned the sort of environmental impacts issue. And I think one of the really, again, opportunities that we see here is that this really, for us, is a technology advancement, and it's critical that we take advantage of all the good time offshore. And so we're definitely working on, initiatives and partnerships that will advance monitoring technologies, which are important to make sure, because we do have these, just significant number of logistics offshore, and we want to make sure that we can work smoothly, work safely, and be protective. And I think a lot of that ties back to making sure we can do a lot of real-time monitoring of the species of concern, and the mitigation itself in terms of advancing the technology on the wind turbines and doing that at the same time that we advance the mitigation technologies. So with that, I will stop. I will turn it back to our hosts and look forward to the conversation.
Rachel, thank you so much for the Vineyard perspective and the broader regional perspective. There were some great ideas in there. Thank you for addressing our opportunities, as you call them, and reminding us that challenges are opportunities. Next, pleasure to introduce Danielle Jensen. She's the Mayflower Integration Manager with Shell. Danielle, Mayflower is a joint venture between Shell and EDP Renewables. In this role, Danielle manages integrated decisions, strategy, and risks across technical, permitting, and commercial teams. Danielle joined Mayflower from the Shell side, where she previously worked in New Orleans and offshore in the Gulf of Mexico, supporting two of Shell's largest tension lake platforms. Her work there included offshore operations support and project execution for topsides and subsea equipment. And we look forward to hearing how Danielle has brought that experience to Mayflower. And with no further delay, Danielle.
Hello, nice to see everyone virtually. Also sad that we couldn't be together in person for OTC, but hopefully you can see my screen in a few moments and we can talk through some of my shares. Thanks, Craig, for the introduction, and Pam and OTC for hosting us. happy to chat with you all. Today, I'm going to talk through Mayflower and just a little project overview. You already heard some from Boam and Ruth, as well as Rachel just now, so I'll try to be quick. I'd like to dive into a little bit of the technical challenges as I'm on the technical team and come from the engineering side, just to show you, or folks that are more oil and gas centric, just the magnitude and the scale of what we're dealing with offshore wind. And then some key similarities and differences between wind and oil and gas. So as Craig mentioned, Mayflower is a joint venture between Shell and EDPR. We did this to combine some of our experience, so Shell specifically in the Gulf of Mexico, that's where I come from, and EDPR with a lot of experience with onshore wind and some offshore wind in Europe. Safety first and safety always is a core value, and I'll kind of leave that there for the Mayflower first introduction. So here's where Mayflower sits. As Rachel showed, this is the Massachusetts, Rhode Island lease areas, and Mayflower is the proud lessee of this OCS 0521. So we heard earlier, that's outer continental shelf, so pretty similar to Gulf of Mexico. BOEM has the responsibility to lease these areas, and we have this blue area. We're planning to produce power via hundreds of wind turbines, and then put that in an export cable up to Cape Cod. We're showing here Falmouth to Bourne is our plan. So quite far offshore, quite a big lease area relative to oil and gas. This is just a generic kind of schematic to talk through. So we start with the generation in turbines in the lease area. As I said, there'll be hundreds of these. We'll tie them together with inter-array cables to an offshore substation. I did see some comments and questions about substations, so they can vary in size. You can have many smaller substations or one big one. And then that substation will transform the power up to a higher voltage and send that underground or buried cables to an onshore substation, overhead, and then to a point of interconnection. So that's where we're tying into the grid and the larger transmission system. Again, Rachel mentioned lots of grid stability issues because transmission systems are often not built with offshore wind in mind, but opportunities, I guess, not obstacles. So just to talk through again, those pieces kind of give you the scale of these things. So the first picture on the left is a foundation. It's a monopile type. Foundations are fixed to the seafloor for the most part in what we're planning. So these foundations could be monopiles or jackets. A monopile shown, we're looking at water depths around 60 meters. That we're going to drive that monopile into the seafloor about 40 meters for stability. And then it's going to stick out above the water some amount so that we can protect the turbine tower from waves. So that means the total monopile is about 110 meters long or 330 feet, so quite massive in scale. And then we're going to put a turbine on top. So these turbines shown are 6 megawatts each, and we're looking at upwards of 12 megawatts now. So really, really big turbines where that tower is 135 meters up to that hub. Like I said, there's going to be hundreds. And then we're going to tie them together with inter-array cables. That's the picture in the top right. Those will be buried so that we don't have fissure or anything get caught on any of the cables. Those will tie the cables, each of the turbines' power generation in series up to offshore substations. These could be AC or DC, so alternating current or direct current. You could have one massive offshore substation as big as 1,200 megawatts, or you could have many smaller. There's advantages and disadvantages, as you could imagine. And then the export cable is going to go to shore. So just wanted to show you guys some pictures so maybe folks aren't familiar with how everything looks. When we make the onshore landing, we're looking at horizontal directional drilling most likely, and then we'll connect to the grid underground and then overhead in lines. So some key technical challenges creating this design in this process. So Brian talked about the construction operation plan, the COP. This COP is a document, a permit that we're going to apply for, and it takes years, a couple of years of time just to incorporate all the environmental impact assessments and make sure that we have the appropriate mitigations. So that means that we need to plan a design envelope for the future that would show what could happen. So technology that may not exist now, but we believe turbines might grow in size or stability. So we have to kind of imagine what will come and then put that into our envelope. We want to integrate across our different modules and packages also. So we want to make a robust foundation design that fits with the turbine design and make sure the safety considerations are taken across the interfaces of the two. And then we want to optimize. We want to produce as much power as we can and then get that power to shore with as little electrical losses as possible, both so we can make money and so that we can take advantage of the resource that we have. I won't go too much into transmission. I think Rachel touched on the grid issues. And so we just have some system impact studies to make sure that that's going to work. But installation is another big challenge for us. So you can imagine hundreds of these massive monopiles, turbines, and blades. To get them to our lease site and installed safely is a big challenge. So that's kind of the key technical challenges. I would say, just to pull some similarities and differences between oil and gas. Similarities were on the Outer Continental Shelf we discussed. It's critical to work with some of the same regulatory agencies, the Coast Guard, BOEM, and that way we understand our safety management systems and emergency response plans. These projects are massive, so I think that's a strength that Shell brings. There's a lot of big upfront investment, long life cycles, but we can make an integrated project at scale by matching everything together. So a full picture of design, installation, operations, and decommissioning. Last thing to leave you with is some of the key differences I see with oil and gas and offshore wind. So a TLP or a SPAR, any big platform offshore oil and gas, is designed as one installed package. So highly complex, but usually a single installation. We're working with hundreds, so we have issues of serial defects, or we have more interfaces and more contractors where we need to really be cost effective about churning out and installing these things rapidly. In oil and gas, it's very high risk and high return. You can imagine that at a financial investment decision, when you go to drill wells, you don't know even then the subsurface uncertainty, so you might still have some challenges. Where in offshore wind, we hope to moderate and reduce most of those risks. So by final investment decision, we really should have known contractors and turbines, foundations, everything should be as low risk as possible. Construction risk remaining, but otherwise much less risky of an investment as compared to oil and gas. So that leads to different levers in how you might finance a project. Also, oil and gas is operations heavy. So I came from this platform in the picture, Mars, where there's 180 people offshore. Offshore wind, we won't have anyone full-time living on the offshore substations. We will have crews that will go out and perform maintenance and a lot of vessels in the area, but it's a lot lighter in terms of interaction and maintenance requirements. And then finally, I won't go into too much because Brian did a good job explaining, but the regulatory regime, as Ruth mentioned also, we've got 40 years of maturity in deep water, and we have obviously just a few turbines offshore in the US. So we're evolving and trying to work with the regulators to inform how wind in the US will look and take advantage of world and oil and gas best practices. So yeah, quick rundown. I think the rest of the panelists did a great job of introducing, so I'll leave it there. Look forward to any questions you have.
Danielle, thank you so much. And I think that ending contrast and comparison with Mars, which is somewhat of an iconic project in the offshore oil and gas industry with the challenges of offshore wind, was great. So thank you for the good summary.
Thanks.
And with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our final panelist, Aaron Smith. Aaron serves as a chief commercial officer at Principal Power, with overall responsibility for business development, strategy, and public affairs. He has been with the company since 2016 and previously served as vice president, strategy, and commercial. Prior to joining Principal Power, Aaron was an economist at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory here in the United States in Colorado, where he directed a portfolio of work designed to identify high-value R&D opportunities for land-based and offshore wind technologies, providing the U.S. Department of Energy with strategic decision support. So joining us today from Portugal is Aaron Smith. Thanks, Aaron.
Great. Thanks so much for that, Craig. You hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and you can see my slides.
Perfect.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Craig, and all the organizers at OTC, and for the audience for tuning in on LinkedIn and YouTube. Today, we'll shift tact a little bit and talk about floating offshore wind, which is the next frontier in the offshore wind market. And let's see. So I'll be happy to guide you through this. I'll start with a little bit of an introduction to Principal Power. Then I'll talk about the global floating offshore wind market and status today, some of our activities in the international market and the lessons learned, and then how we're trying to bring that experience back to unlock the US market potential. So our company is really founded on the belief that floating wind technology is essential to unlocking the full potential of the deep sea. So this chart here shows the breakdown of the wind resource by water depth globally, and shows that the over 80% of the wind resource is located in water deeper than 40 meters and 70% greater than 60 meters. So this creates a high demand for proven cost-competitive floating solutions. Because floating wind enables project sponsors the flexibility to select the best sites, really regardless of depth or seabed conditions, the technology can dramatically expand the number of places where you can deploy offshore wind and allow the industry to expand from kind of a regional industry to one that is global in nature. And so I guess as an example, in the United States, we see a lot of the early activities concentrated on the eastern seaboard, where you have a very wide, very shallow continental shelf out to about 60 meters, well over 80 miles from shore. But in certain areas like the Gulf Coast or the west coast of the US or some of our islands, we don't have that same sort of continental shelf, and so you have to go into much deeper water, and that's where floating technologies come in. The impact is quite massive, with resource potential that exceeds global energy demand and load factors that can range from 40 to 60% delivered to the grid. So this industry has a really tremendous potential to contribute to overall decarbonization goals and objectives, and deliver competitive energy to our load centers across the world. Principal Power is a small technology company. We were founded in 2007 to serve the deep water wind market. We've got about 100 people, and our headquarters are in the United States in California, and we have a global footprint. Our principal product is the WindFloat, which is a floating platform with a semi-submersible architecture. It's been adapted from the oil and gas sector to meet the specific requirements of floating wind. This technology was first deployed in 2011 in Portugal, and then fully proven with 7 years of experience in operations offshore. This year, we've also completed the commissioning of our full-scale WindFloat Atlantic project that features 8.4 megawatt turbines, and that's also in Portugal. And as we look forward, we're currently working with our customers to execute 2 more small commercial projects between 30 and 50 megawatts in scale in Scotland and France. And then the WindFloat has been selected as the technology of choice for several gigawatts worth of projects in Europe, the US, and Asia. In the past 2 years, we've seen quite a big shift in the industry, where a lot of familiar household names from both the oil and gas sector and the offshore wind sector have started to take positions in floating wind projects around the world. And so we're tracking about 30 gigawatts of projects globally that are under development. And while most of these projects are still in the early phases, many of the projects are on the order of 1 to 2 gigawatts of individual capacity, which is providing the market pull for the industrialization of the sector as it goes beyond the technology demonstration phase. In the slightly longer term, we see just enormous potential for the industry to grow. The Carbon Trust Joint Industry Project, which is a project that's made up of several of the leading offshore wind sponsors, has just published projections this summer suggesting that over 10 gigawatts of floating capacity could be installed from 2030, with 70 gigawatts delivered by 2030 or 40, and that's up from about 100 gigawatts installed today. So I think that gives a bit of a sense of the potential of the industry if we can do it well. And I think speed and scale of this is really premised on having good and conducive political and regulatory factors that enable the industry to expand, because unlike land-based renewables, offshore wind will always be subject to national government, federal permitting agencies, and these sorts of things. And so the timelines tend to be complex. They tend to require the development of specific rules. And we really do need to see policies that are addressing the specific requirements of the industry to enable a virtuous cycle of cost reduction and basically give people the ability to get control over sites and take those forward through the development process. So as we look at this chart and the regional breakdown between North America, Europe, and Asia, right now, this body, which of course is based in Europe, so maybe a little bit biased, sees most of the development happening in Europe and Asia through about the mid-2030s, when North America starts to pick up. This does not have to be the case. We see a number of project opportunities in the US, for example, that could move quite a bit more quickly, but it does require that we have the minimum political conditions in place to make that happen. Looking at some of what we've been trying to accomplish over in Europe, just a brief highlight of the WindFloat Atlantic project. So this is a project that was fully commissioned this summer. It consists of 3 8.4 megawatt turbines from MHI Vestas on our WindFloat semi-submersible foundations, which you can see in yellow on the screen. These are the largest wind turbines ever to be installed on a floating structure. The project is located over 20 kilometers from shore and in 100 meters of water depth. The units were installed, as you can see here, at port with a standard land-based crane, and then towed to the site using conventional anchor handling tugs, where they were hooked up to a conventional catenary mooring system that was pre-installed before the arrival of the units. This project was built in local shipyards in Portugal and Spain, and is the first floating project to obtain bank financing in the world. We look at WindFloat Atlantic as a real springboard for the industry. It's helped us to develop a lot of lessons learned that are feeding forward both into the technology, how we run our execution plans for our projects, and the advice that we give to our customers about how to develop floating wind projects effectively. So I'll just keep running this video on loop, and I think this is a pretty huge milestone from the industry. It does give us that empirical data to increase our confidence in design and bankability, to have conversations with classification societies about the appropriate design standards for floating wind, recognizing that most of our standards come from the oil and gas space and may be a bit more conservative, given that these platforms are unmanned and that sort of thing. We also need that everybody recognize that the interface between the floating foundation designer and the wind turbine supplier is quite important. The coupled dynamics of floating wind turbines and the mid-ocean environment should not be underestimated, and it is quite important that there is operational experience at a certain scale before you start going and installing hundreds of these units. That could be a big challenge to learn on that scale of a project. And finally, these projects have been giving us experience and refinements that allow us to adjust and optimize our design choices and fabrication methods, our logistical processes, as well as data that can be used to support permitting processes and environmental reviews and interactions with stakeholders in multiple different environments. As we look to the next phase for the company, we're supporting projects that are in scales of 100 to 1,000 megawatts. And as we're doing that, and with our compatriots in the floating offshore wind industry, the focus is really on how do you industrialize and how do you deliver 100 units in a period of 2 to 3 years. Because basically this is the requirement from the industry to have financeable projects that make economic sense. So here, the first step in our view is that you have to recognize that these projects are going to be very different than the pre-commercial projects that we've been developing, the 3 to 5 unit projects. And they're also very different, as Danielle mentioned, from the one-off projects that are typical in the oil and gas industry where you only have to install one unit in a complex operation, but you only have to do it once. So here we're talking about units that, or projects that will require over 100,000 tons of fabricated steel, 100 mooring legs, and those things all to be installed in 1 to 2 to 3 years. So what this means for us is that you have to really have a view towards the design basis in a comprehensive fashion from the beginning, paying attention to the site conditions, the wind turbine technology, the classification requirements, all the temporary limitations and constraints that you might have in the fabrication yards or local content or at quayside or things like this. And we need to recognize that any of the process or design efficiencies that we might encounter through that process stand to be repeated 30 to 50 times. So it's really important to get things right from the beginning, and our experience with small scale projects gives us the ability to test those things with low risk exposure. So as we look at this, we create design bases that consider holistically the full set of requirements that the units are going to experience throughout the course of their life, looking both at the permanent in situ configuration during operations and the operations and maintenance phase, as well as the temporary phases like the wind turbine integration at the quayside, the assembly and load out, and the subcomponent production. And this gives us the ability to make the best choice and assure full compatibility between our design choices as an engineering firm and the supply chain capabilities and constraints in the local area. As we look to how we bring this technology home, I'll point out one of the flagship projects that we're working on in the United States. As a US headquartered company, we're always looking for these sorts of opportunities. And I think the Redwood Coast Offshore Wind project is a very unique one in that it's born out of a public-private partnership with the Redwood Coast Energy Authority, which is a local load-serving entity in Humboldt County in California. This project, or this entity ran a competitive RFQ, and they selected the WindFlow technology as well as a delivery consortium that is shown on the slide here to partner with for this project. And while this project is in a quite challenging location, it's 25 miles from shore in waters that are 600 to 1,000 meters deep. It does have a world-class wind resource, and it has some additional benefits in that it is outside of the operational area of the U.S. Department of Defense and the Navy. And it does have, I guess, some transmission capacity that would limit the project size, but it could move quite quickly and has the potential to be operational by 2025. This is, however, pending the launch of a BOEM auction process for the West Coast of the U.S., where most of the sites in the U.S. area on the West Coast and in Hawaii, despite having been on the table since 2016 or 2018, we are still waiting to see when an auction process might happen. So we see this project and similar projects that we're involved in, and that others in the floating wind industry are progressing as being critical to the achievement of the U.S. DOE and DOI offshore wind strategy, which does call for 86 gigawatts of offshore wind to be installed by 2050. With diverse installations across the West Coast islands, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Northeast, all aspects that may require floating wind to reach those sort of targets. In order to get started, we believe that the industry really does need to see progress on the BOEM auction process, because it must be recognized that the major investments where you're asking industry to basically spend between 40 and 100 million of CapEx before starting to enter construction, it means that you need to have security of the site. You need to know that you have site control before you're willing to invest that money, or before you can even start the long permitting process that is required before you get your construction and operations permit. So I think our message is that there's substantial appetite for these competitive auction processes from the industry. We highlight that BOEM did receive 14 indications of interest for the West Coast call areas that were held in 2019, and we're looking forward to seeing this move forward so that the U.S. can maintain technology leadership in floating wind. Just to conclude briefly, so the small commercial projects that we're running in Europe and the others are running in Europe are providing indispensable experience to mature and de-risk the technology for use in larger projects. We're seeing the industry basically accept floating technology, and we are observing that there are 30 gigawatts of projects under development globally, and this is providing a pull for the industrialization of the sector. And finally, in the US, floating wind has the potential to unlock a substantial amount of resource here and contribute to national and state goals for decarbonization and create enormous opportunities for the supply chain. But we do need to see regulatory and political process to allow for the industry to move these products forward. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Greg. Thank you very much, and look forward to the discussion.
Aaron, thank you very much for a good comprehensive talk on floating wind and some of the newest technologies and the projects that you guys are working on. We really appreciate that good perspective. And thank you all for all the great questions that have been coming in. Pam and I are going to moderate a few of the questions out to our panelists so that we can hear from a broad range of perspectives. One of our first questions is on decommissioning of renewable energy projects. Back to Brian. And Brian, the question was specifically on what do the decommissioning requirements look like? How are those relevant, given that we're looking at hopefully indefinite marine renewable energy projects? And also, what are the timelines on the permitting you gave? So with that, we'll kick it to Brian.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, for decommissioning, the question also touched on if we should not have a decommissioning requirement. Our decommissioning requirements are based on the life of a wind turbine generator and its components. And so after the lease term ends and the project is required by BOEM to be decommissioned, which means removal of the wind turbine and all of its components, the developer or the leasee can request an extension to the lease term and then make any necessary improvements or modifications to the project where they would be able to operate for a longer period of time. So there is that ability to apply for that, and then BOEM would do a review of that and determine whether they were going to approve that or not. So it doesn't necessarily have to be decommissioned at the end of the lease term. There was also the question of the project timeline, leasing till commissioning. A lot of that is developer driven. After a lease is issued, developers have a 1-year preliminary term to submit their site assessment plan, and then 5 years to submit their COP after that. So, you're looking at 6 years there, but generally construction operation plans are submitted earlier than that. So I can kind of give you a timeline from, based on our regulations for how long it takes from the issuance of like a notice or the submittal of a COP, let's say, until you could, get full approval. So if a construction operation plan comes in, about 6 months for our completeness and sufficiency review, then about 2 years from the notice of intent until we have all federal approvals. So that's about 2.5 years right there. And then after a project is approved, you have to submit a facility design report and a fabrication and installation report, 2 engineering reports, which I believe we have 6 weeks to review and provide comments. So, and either, there's not like an approval or denial, but it's really an objection process. So it's pretty quick after a COP is submitted, theoretically, but the overall project timeline from lease issuance to actual installation can be quite lengthy depending on how fast the developer moves on the project.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think we have questions from Pam next.
Yes, please. So I've been looking at the questions and monitoring our chat here. There's a few questions about the challenges of supply chain, and I'd like to direct that to both to Danielle and to Ruth Perry here.
Sure, I can take a stab. I commented on one of them. So I think that the questions were around what does the supply chain look like in the U.S. and how are we going to react and build all of these projects and build that supply chain out, which is a really good question. So in Europe, there's obviously gigawatts of wind, hundreds of turbines, and in the US, there's, I think, 7 installed. So we're looking to really ramp up to the levels that they're at, and that's going to take some time. I think once the first project or two starts to get going, those manufacturers will start to move operations to be manufactured here. But in the meantime, I think there's going to be an interim where we're going to have a transportation plan to get the technology that's built in Europe, in China, or in the Middle East, and transfer it over to the US before we have a full-fledged supply chain here. So I think more to come, and I think we're excited for the supply chain and jobs to grow in the US, but there's going to have to be some of both for now.
Yeah, Danielle's right. And I think you're starting to see local investments. Greg alluded to this in terms of what the states are requiring for solicitation to try to accelerate those supply chain timelines. There's a lot of activity that's happening in the Gulf. As many of you know, the opportunities for fabrication, storage, and vessel transport can leverage what existing infrastructure we have in the Gulf. So Shell's been working and talking with the state of Louisiana and some of those other providers, as well as the American Wind Energy Association and other points in that supply chain. Obviously, the same challenges with what we talked about with U.S. statutes, one of those being the Jones Act, which regulates maritime commerce. It requires U.S. flagged vessels for transportation activities, but not construction activities, is going to be one of those things that we have to overcome. And so that is, all a work in progress, but one of the opportunities to figure out how to overcome that, but also bring some of that supply chain locally where it makes sense in the Northeast and utilize it in other places in the U.S., like the Gulf of Mexico, where it makes sense. And I think once that market and the commercial viability, we get those triggers and the permitting decisions like Rachel talked about, where there are now going to be utility scale projects, that's going to provide the certainty that our supply chain vendors need so that they really start to optimize that business and build it in the U.S.
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you, Ruth. And I'd like to also bring in Aaron to this conversation to address some of those questions that regard the Jones Act. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Pam. I think that the Jones Act is and has been a challenge for the U.S. industry in the oil and gas sector and now in the offshore wind sector for some time. I think we saw the news the other day that the first U.S. flagged vessel is going to be built for a price tag of about $500 million, which is a pretty expensive vessel. And one of the interesting elements of the floating technology that we've developed is the fact that you are able to actually install the turbines at the port and then float them out using standard U.S. flagged vessels. So this is maybe one of the advantages of floating wind, but it also will require investment in ports similar to, I guess, what Greg described as their very ambitious investment program that they're undertaking in New York to establish New York as a leader.
Thank you. Craig, go back to you for a few more questions, please.
Yeah, thanks for the good discussion on that. And there's many follow-on discussions along those topics too, but we'll keep moving on in regards to time here. So, Greg, I'd like to ask you a question that came up on how to gain public and policy support. I think not only where you've been dealing directly in New York, but how do you see us overcoming those challenges?
I think to a large degree, it relies on folks recognizing the impetus of climate change. Renewable energy is an important component in fighting climate change. And oftentimes we hear from the public, it's this perception of either offshore wind or nothing. And in fact, saying no to offshore wind is the same as saying yes to the status quo. There are a lot of issues with our energy systems currently in terms of emissions and how they affect public health as well as climate. And so I think it's important to think about climate change in thinking about offshore wind. In that regard, we've had a lot of success meeting with the public one-on-one on the floor. And so we do routine road shows, if you will, around New York and sit down with folks and talk with them and be honest with them about the things that we know about offshore wind and the value it brings, its co-location with load centers and other related aspects of it. But additionally, being clear that there are some things we don't fully recognize and that we're continuing to work on those through research projects and collaborations and other things. So it's important both to set the basis on this need to address climate change, but also be honest with folks about what needs to get done and how we can accomplish this in the most cost-effective and responsible way. I think it goes the same on the policy level, although there's a different perspective in some cases, whether people are embracing renewable energy or not. But we need to identify the needs to fill the knowledge gaps and start addressing them. But we should be there's an impetus to move very quickly on this front to be sure that we can accomplish the slowing of climate change and issues that we're seeing around the country and around the world right now. So a combination of honesty and keeping it in the context of the larger issues.
Thanks, Greg. That was a great answer there. And Pam has our next question.
Yes, so I'd like to direct this question to Rachel. We have several comments here wanting to learn more about overcoming environmental challenges. So, Rachel, when we say challenges, we mean opportunities, right?
Absolutely. And I'll just give, I think the short answer is one at a time, but that's not a very satisfying answer. So I'll expand on that a little bit, but I'll give you a quick example of something that Vineyard Wind is working on. Is we have a startup challenge going on with a local incubator that's actually just expanded into Houston, Greentown Labs. And so that local, when I say local, I mean the Boston area. And we're basically working with a number of startups to move the detection ability forward for offshore real-time detection of specifically whales. And in our case, the North Atlantic right whale is a big issue. It's down to less than 400 in the population as a total. So it's a pretty significant concern. And moving that monitoring technology forward does not just allow us to, install the project in the way, in the most efficient manner, but it also just moves that technology forward on the whole and helps everyone know more about this critically endangered species. So call that the opportunity. The challenge is we need to know where they are and what they're doing. And frankly, we needed to know that before offshore wind. We need to know it now more because of offshore wind, and we also benefit in other ways from doing that kind of work. So I think the same is true with a number of the other issues on fisheries. There's Ruth talked a lot about the science aspect here. So the science is going to be the key to overcoming environmental challenges and making sure we understand the impacts themselves the best we can. And I think we're going to really heavily study the first few projects so we can feed that back into all of the projects under discussion.
Thank you very much, Rachel. It's good to hear too that the communication is really key in this, and thanks for bringing that up. Next, we received, given that this is hurricane season and we have an active hurricane season, there was a question about how we're accounting for sites and design in light of hurricanes in many of these areas. And I'd like to address that question to Ruth.
Sure. Thanks, Craig. Yeah, good question, considering I have some friends that are getting hit by Sally as we speak, and we had a major evacuation in our Gulf of Mexico assets for Laura a few weeks ago, and one of our buoys measuring upwards of 50-foot wave height. So yeah, definitely real. For the offshore wind industry, this is certainly something that goes into design and criteria, but if you focused on what Danielle was showing, a lot of the structures that we're using in terms of this embedded seafloor structure, platforms, jackets, those have gone through the design criteria process through oil and gas in the very early stages of offshore oil and gas. So there's some cross comparisons there in terms of the foundations and those criteria studies. Obviously, weighting is going to be an issue with fixed bottom foundations, but that's going to depend on penetration, seafloor depth, and such. In terms of blade infrastructure and turbine infrastructure, They have built-in mechanisms to lock and feather the blades, basically the surface area that's pointing into the wind. So those are going to be some of the response mechanisms and mechanics that are built into the blades themselves, so that they're able to essentially go into a survival mode when storms are coming through. And it's not, not just hurricanes, but nor'easters as well. And then once the storm is passed, then those systems can be turned back so that they can produce energy. So I think, those components are going to come from learning that we've had in the North Sea and European areas that have dealt with longer sustained winds, and then combine that with foundation knowledge that we have from other areas like the Gulf of Mexico, and you'll see that play out. But that's certainly something that's top of mind for developers, and that's why it's critical that we have really good Med-Ocean data and criteria analysis, and supplement that with the data that we're collecting offshore now. So all of that criteria is set into place when we're going through the COP process and the certification process, and the facility design reports that we'll have to do. Once we have our final environmental approvals, we have to go through that engineering design approval before we're actually able to install. And I posted a link with some additional information in the chat as well for folks to reference back to, that Department of Energy has put together on criteria for offshore wind turbines.
Thanks, Ruth. And we're excited to see that data. That's incredible that you guys have been able to get such good data this season in light of the damage the hurricanes are causing, that we're still able to really inform the science for planning in the future. And Pam, I think you're going to handle our next question.
Yes, well, HSE, health, safety, and environment and security is at the forefront of our industry and very important. And we have a few questions that are asking about how HSE is reported in the wind industry. And Danielle, I think you have a few comments to share about HSE and reporting structure in the wind energy environment.
Yeah, I think, like we mentioned, there's obviously a lot of experience that we can lean on in Europe in terms of offshore wind. So there's a group called the Global Offshore Wind Health and Safety Organization, or G+. It used to be for the number of members, but they just went with plus because they have a lot of members now. So they publish statistics that are global for offshore wind. I can put that link in the sidebar. We're leaning on that experience, and we're also looking at the experience we bring in offshore oil and gas. So a lot of the vessels working at heights, working with the lockout tagout, we can really apply a lot of that across industries, the experience that we have already in oil. Not all of it applicable, but a lot of it is in how we move people and safe transfers. If we evacuate for a hurricane, I think that all applies. So we are trying to be as open and transparent as possible and really learn from each other, especially where we can.
Yeah, so important, health and safety, especially in environments such as the offshore, where we all want to make sure that we go off to work and come back to our families and our friends in the same condition that we went and we left. I speak from experience of being offshore for many years. So HSE is such a critical role in these projects. So thank you for sharing that, Danielle. Craig, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you. So throughout, we've gotten a lot of questions. We have a lot of folks joining us from a number of countries in Africa and interested in the development of offshore wind projects in Africa. Aaron, you've had a good perspective moving from the US to now Portugal and looking globally at applications for principal power, but also investing in the industry in general. What are your thoughts about offshore wind development in Africa?
We're actually starting to see some movement from different developers in Africa. I mean, I think there's a tremendous offshore wind resource in many countries, especially if you look at Morocco or South Africa. The challenge is that the political and regulatory regimes are generally not set up for offshore wind yet. And so in that respect, it may take some time to get those markets going. I did share, for those that are listening on YouTube, a link to the World Bank Offshore Wind Program, where they have developed a lot of fairly comprehensive wind resource maps for a number of different high potential countries in the world. And I think that that's something to check out for further detail to see if the country that you're interested in actually has the resource.
Thanks.
Thank
Good
you.
to hear the global perspective on that. And Pam, I think you had a question.
Well, first I want to comment, I'm duly impressed with the number of people on this conversation as well as the number of countries that are represented here. And so I did see, I'll open up the floor and maybe one of our panelists can help us here answer some questions about, we had a comment regarding self-installing jack-up barges and platforms being used, maybe perhaps more so than floating semi-submersibles. Not sure if maybe Ruth or Danielle being with Shell, if you have any comments that you could add about the types of different equipment that could be used for installation of offshore wind turbines, the generators.
Yeah, I can maybe start. So we're definitely considering all options, all options on the table that we can, and see what the environmental impacts are, what the availability and crane systems look like, and those are constantly evolving. So pretty typical in the North Sea is a jack-up barge. So you would load out maybe three foundations, 3 turbine towers, and 3 sets of nacelles, hubs, and blades all at once, and go and install those in series. It's going to be a bit different for us. It depends on what ports we have access to and the strength of their quayside, how we can, move those boats in and out, how tall are they, can they access the port, getting under bridges. So there's still a lot to figure out, but I would say all options on the table for what types of vessels, if they're DP vessels, anchored, or jack-up barges, and that'll change for turbines or offshore substations depending on each aspect, how much they weigh and how tall they are. So we're open to options, whatever vessels come out in the next few years. We're all ears.
Thank you, Danielle. We also have another question here that I'll take on from Liam Bradbury. How dependent is the cost of a commercial project on the port infrastructure availability to accommodate those large supply chains? So this falls into supply chain, which you talked about earlier, Danielle. And so I'll turn this to you, but you can feel free to turn this turn this question about how much the port part of it plays into other people on this panel.
Yeah, I think Greg mentioned a bit, so maybe he wants to jump in, or Rachel, on developing ports infrastructure in the States. For us, like I said, a lot of scope is still an option. We'd like to see what ports are available, and we'd like to collaborate, and we're doing so in New Bedford to do some port upgrades. So there's a lot of costs that we're considering in the infrastructure upgrades that's going to be required before we can deliver this amount of wind turbines, foundations, and structures to our sites. I don't know, Rachel or Greg, if you want to add in your port infrastructure plans.
Yeah, I can add a little bit more to the port issue, and I think it's so one thing that's very different is we have a lot of challenges with the ports in the Northeast for this exact purpose, and I think you run into areas where bridges would limit your ability to move equipment in and out, which we have to do a lot of, this being sort of a logistics project. And so and they're also small. Real estate in the Northeast is not abundantly available, particularly that along the coastline. The port issue is I don't think people fully realize how much we need to build this out, but frankly, we need all the ports. We need them all, as many of them outfitted as possible to do that. So it does play into, of course, it plays into the price, but the supply chain and the ports as a whole for a new industry is always going to be, or ports being, whatever you need for the new industry, is always a risk until it's fully built out. But there's many port communities up and down the East Coast that would really welcome that revitalization, and have been working very hard. There's a good competition going amongst the ports Nice and healthy competition. So don't tell them I said we'll use them all. But you know, it's critical for us, and making sure it's designed right is also important. So it's a major focus.
Yeah, I think that's a really great message. Thank you, Rachel. I have to say, I'm going to turn it over back to Craig. I have to drop off for a few minutes, but I will leave this in Craig's hands. And I just wanted to say farewell to everyone, and thank you so much for your participation from all across the globe. It's really impressive. And while I too miss OTC, I think that this is a really great venue for something in the interim until we can meet in person again. And I look forward to it. I hope that will happen next year. So Craig and everybody, all our panelists, thank you so much for everything that you've done today.
Thank you, Pamela. I do want to give Greg a quick minute to follow up on a final thought regarding the ports as well, just to give you one final kick at that.
Yeah, I just would add that it's an interesting time that we're in that each of the states are in competition, in a sense, for port development and becoming the supply chain hub and port development hubs. So I think this is one of those things that will continue for a while and eventually settle out, and things will become more collaborative, if you will, over time. So I think everyone's in the push now to make sure that they're able to supply as much of the offshore wind opportunities as they can to their states. But then eventually, as things settle out, it'll become much more collaborative and cost effective for everyone.
Thank you very much, Greg. And I do want to echo, thank you very much for everyone joining us today and providing great questions. Thank you very much to our panelists. I appreciate you taking the time to join us and really provide good and important feedback for the industry. And above and beyond all, thank you to the Offshore Technology Conference for hosting this. And hopefully next year we get to see everyone live and in person. Otherwise, we do have good virtual options that will continue. So thanks again, everyone, and we appreciate all of your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Greg.
Take care.